A dying ranch the bank already believed it owned outright. By nightfall, a cowgirl named Josephine Hale and her secret skill would change everything. She had carried that skill off the train at Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, on an August afternoon in 1881. She stepped down onto the platform with a rolled leather toolkit slung over one shoulder. Dust from 3 states still worked into the seams of her traveling clothes, and looked out at a drought-choked ranch town that did not yet know what had just arrived in it. Waiting for her beside a buckboard wagon stood a rancher named Eli Brennan, hat in his hands, dust past his boots, watching the last of his hope disembark from a train he half-wished had never come at all. He had written that advertisement 5 months earlier, back when the creek still ran and the ledger still held a few honest numbers. He had not written it expecting a woman who would step off that platform and inside a single afternoon out-argue the mountain itself. I have spent the better part of 2 decades combing through frontier letters, land office ledgers, and the handwritten accounts old newspapermen filed and forgot, looking for the stories worth carrying forward whole, not trimmed down to the parts that flatter anybody. This is one of the rare ones with 2 fires burning at once, and neither makes full sense without the other. There is Josephine's fire, the one that taught a girl with nothing to spare how to read an animal's suffering with her own 2 hands before she ever learned much of anything the schoolhouse thought a girl ought to know. And there is Eli's fire, the slow, grinding kind that burns a man down to the studs of himself until he stops fighting and merely endures. Stay for both. By the time this story reaches its end, on a dirt street in front of a bank that thought it already owned the outcome, you will understand exactly why a woman nobody expected to matter walked in and changed the arithmetic of an entire valley. Josephine Hale had grown up on 80 played-out acres outside of Ogallala, Nebraska, the only child of a father who doctored other men's livestock for $2 a call because his own small herd had never amounted to much more than a milk cow and a temperamental mule. She rode beside him from the time she could sit a saddle, holding lanterns while he worked a breech calf loose in the dark, learning the particular language of an animal in pain long before she learned much else. Her father died when she was 19, thrown from a green horse he had no business mounting at his age, and left her with a debt-clear name, a set of doctoring tools wrapped in oiled leather, and nothing whatsoever resembling a plan. She went to Omaha because the Union Pacific stockyards paid wages to anyone willing to do the ugly, necessary work of grading, doctoring, and dressing cattle by the thousand. And a woman willing to work harder than the men beside her eventually stopped being turned away at the gate. 12 years she spent in those yards, first cleaning pens for a wage men wouldn't stoop to, then doctoring sick stock nobody else wanted near, and finally, because she had an eye for it that couldn't be taught, grading beef on the hoof for buyers who came to trust her word over their own foreman's. She learned bloat and blackleg and screwworm, learned tanning and rendering when the yards needed hides worked fast, and learned, above everything, that a woman's worth in that world was measured strictly in what her hands could prove. She kept a line from Annie Oakley clipped from a newspaper and pinned inside her trunk lid, a line she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. "Aim at a high mark and you will hit it," the sharpshooter had written. No, not the first time, nor the second time, and maybe not the third, but keep on aiming and keep on shooting, for only practice will make you perfect. Josephine had aimed at competence so long and so hard that she had very nearly forgotten to aim at anything softer. She read Eli Brennan's advertisement in a Cheyenne newspaper a stockyard buyer had left folded on a bench. 3 sparse lines asking for a capable woman willing to keep a house and share a hard life on a failing cattle operation in Larkspur Hollow. No romance promised, no comfort implied. Most women would have passed over it for the kinder-sounding notices beside it. Josephine read it twice and felt something in her chest sit up and take notice, because underneath the plain, almost apologetic wording, she recognized the shape of a ranch in genuine trouble. And trouble, unlike romance, was a language she actually spoke fluently. She was 28 years old, unmarried by choice as much as circumstance, tired of grading other men's cattle in a yard that would never once let her hold a deed of her own, and she wrote back within the week, not the letter of a woman hoping to be chosen, but the letter of a woman making an offer. I can doctor stock, grade beef, tan a hide, and keep a ledger honest, she wrote. I am not delicate and do not require gentle handling. If your ranch is dying the way your letter suggests, I would rather come try to save something than spend one more year making other men rich off animals I never got to keep. She packed her tools, her father's old rendering knife, and 12 years of saved stockyard wages folded into a boot, and boarded the westbound train without telling herself it was anything so foolish as hope, though it was, in every way that counted, exactly that. Eli Brennan had inherited Split Rock Ranch from a father who built it out of nothing but stubbornness and 11,000 acres of Wyoming grass. And for 6 years he had run it competently enough that nobody, least of all Eli, expected the drought that arrived the spring he turned 30 and simply refused to leave. The creek that fed his home pasture dropped to a trickle by June and vanished entirely by July. The grass that should have carried 400 head through summer curled brown and brittle before the 4th, and Eli watched his herd shrink, month over month, from 400 down to the gaunt 50-some head he had left scattered across what little green the land still offered. He had gone to the Cattleman's bank of Larkspur Hollow the previous autumn, hat in hand, and mortgaged the deed itself against a loan of $680 to buy feed and hold the operation together through what he was certain, wrongly, would be one bad year and no more. Harlan Voss, the bank's manager, had approved the loan with a thin, patient smile. Eli hadn't understood the true cost of until the second dry summer landed on top of the first, and the bank's patience, it turned out, had never been patience at all, only arithmetic waiting on its moment. It was somewhere in that second brutal summer, watching a favorite gelding go down from thirst before he could even get water to it, that Eli Brennan had written his advertisement, not out of any real hope of romance, but out of a plain, exhausted arithmetic of his own. A man alone on a dying ranch needed another set of hands more than he needed anything resembling comfort. And if a wife happened to be willing to work rather than merely be kept, he would count himself fortunate, regardless of what else came of it. He had mailed the letter 5 months before the drought worsened past anything he had imagined possible. And by the time the reply came back from a woman in Omaha claiming she could doctor stock and grade beef, Eli had very nearly forgotten sending it at all, occupied instead with the daily arithmetic of which animals might survive the week and which would not. He stood on the depot platform the day her train was due, feeling less like a man about to meet his intended wife, and more like a man about to confess a failure to a stranger who had crossed half a continent under false pretenses. He had written the letter when the ranch still had a fighting chance. Now the bank held a note due at the first frost. The herd had dwindled past the point most of his neighbors considered salvageable, and he had nothing honest to offer a woman except debt, drought, and a cabin with a roof that leaked along the north wall. He very nearly turned the wagon around twice on the ride into town that morning. He stayed only because leaving a woman alone on a strange platform, after asking her to cross the country, struck him as a lower kind of cowardice than the one he was already living with daily. When the train's whistle sounded down the valley, Eli Brennan took off his hat, smoothed what there was to smooth of his own ragged dignity, and prepared himself to tell Josephine Hale the truth before she had a chance to feel tricked by it. Josephine did not step down from that train so much as arrive at it, her boots striking the platform boards with a decisiveness that turned more than one head, and she crossed straight toward the only man on the platform holding his hat instead of wearing it. "You're Brennan," she said, not quite a question. "I am," Eli answered, and offered nothing further, because he had promised himself the truth before comfort, and intended to keep that promise even standing in front of a stranger for the first time. "I have to be square with you before we go one step further," he said. "I wrote that letter when I had a fighting ranch. I don't have one now. The bank holds my deed. My herd's down to 50-some starving head, and I owe the Cattleman's Bank of Larkspur Hollow $680. I have no honest way of raising by the 15th of October. You cross the whole country for a man who may lose everything inside of 9 weeks, and I would understand entirely if you wanted back on that train." Josephine studied him the way she had once studied a buyer trying to lowball a healthy steer, unhurried, unbothered, taking his measure and finding him honest, which counted for a great deal more with her than he seemed to understand. 9 weeks, she repeated, 50-some head, $680. She said the figures the way another woman might have repeated wedding vows, committing them to memory because figures, to Josephine Hale, were the only kind of promise she had ever fully trusted. "I spent 12 years in the Omaha stockyards, Mr. Brennan," she said. "I did not come out here for comfort, and I am not leaving because your arithmetic frightens you. Show me the wagon." Eli stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, absorbing the fact that the woman in front of him had just heard the worst of his situation laid bare and answered by asking for directions to the wagon rather than the return train. And something in his chest, long since gone numb, gave one hard, unfamiliar knock. The ride out to Split Rock climbed steadily out of the flat brown grasslands around town into rougher country, switchbacks cut into hillsides gone the color of old rope from weeks without rain. And Josephine took in every gaunt fence post and dry creek bed in silence, cataloging the ranch's condition before she had even seen the house. A freak thunderstorm had rolled through 2 nights before, the first real rain the valley had seen since June, and Eli explained, with the flat voice of a man delivering bad news out of habit, that the sudden downpour had brought the low clover pasture up thick and green and dangerously fast, and that he had turned his remaining herd down onto it that very morning, desperate to put weight on bones before the bank came counting. They crested the final ridge as the sun dropped toward the western peaks, and Split Rock Ranch spread out below them in a shallow bowl of land, a sound log cabin, a leaning barn, a maze of corrals, and beyond it all, the home pasture, thick with new green growth. Eli's whole body went rigid on the wagon seat before Josephine even saw why. Scattered across that pasture, 6 dark shapes lay motionless in the wet grass, and Eli was off the wagon and running before it had fully stopped, Josephine down a half-second behind him, her tool roll already in her hand. By the time they reached the fence line, the disaster had a name Josephine recognized instantly and without a single moment's hesitation. Frothy bloat, the clover fermenting fast and hard in the animals' stomachs, gas trapped behind foam, their sides swollen tight as drumheads, their breath coming in short, panicked heaves. Eli was already reaching for the rifle strapped behind the wagon seat, his voice cracking as he said he'd have to put them down before they suffocated where they lay. And Josephine's answer came out flat, immediate, and utterly without room for argument. "Not one shot, Mr. Brennan. Give me your knife and find me something hollow, the width of my thumb. Now." Eli ran for the barn and came back with a length of hollow copper tubing salvaged from a broken pump fitting, and Josephine took it without a word of thanks or hesitation, already on her knees beside the nearest steer, a rangy red and white animal whose sides looked fit to burst. "Hold his horns to the dirt," she told Eli. "When the pressure drops, he'll thrash, and I need him still." Eli threw his weight across the animal's neck, and Josephine found the hollow triangle of flank behind the last rib, with fingers that had done this exact work 100 times on the killing floors of Omaha. Steers arriving off the cattle cars blown up tight from bad feed and worse water. She drove the knife through hide and muscle in one clean practice stroke, twisted it to open the wound, and a high, thin hiss of trapped gas tore out through the puncture, the sour reek of fermented clover rolling off the animal in a wave that would have staggered a weaker stomach. She didn't flinch. She pulled the blade free and drove the copper tube straight into the wound, and green foam bubbled up through it in a slow, steady rhythm as she leaned her weight against the steer's swollen side, working the gas out with her hands the way she had once learned to coax a stubborn pump. The swelling eased. The animal's breathing slowed from panicked heaving to something almost ordinary, and it let out a long, ragged groan through its nose that Josephine recognized, with real relief, as the sound of an animal choosing to keep living. "Pull the tube when it stops bubbling and bring it here clean," she told Eli. already moving toward the next down steer. "We have 5 more, and the light won't hold forever." For the better part of 2 hours, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and painted the sky the color of a fresh bruise, Josephine and Eli worked their way down the line. Pierce, vent, press, wait, move on, until the last steer staggered upright under a rising moon and shook itself like a dog coming out of a creek. 52 head had gone down in that pasture. 52 head walked away from it, and Split Rock Ranch, against every reasonable expectation Eli had carried onto that platform that morning, was still standing at the end of its first day with Josephine Hale in it. They sat afterward on an overturned feed bucket and a fence rail, both of them soaked in mud and rumen fluid in moonlight, too wrung out for anything resembling conversation at first. Eli finally pulled a reasonably clean bandana from his back pocket and held it out to her, and Josephine took it, wiped the worst of the mess from her hands, and looked out at the herd settling quietly in the pasture, as though nothing at all had nearly gone wrong. "You ruined a good tool roll," Eli said, nodding at the leather satchel now stained and torn where she'd knelt in it. "It was an old roll," she answered. "Bought it second-hand off a retiring stockman in Omaha who told me it had 1 good decade left in it. Looks like it just spent most of that decade in one afternoon." Eli found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could readily account for. "I ordered a housekeeper," he said quietly. "I never expected—" He didn't finish the sentence, and Josephine, unbothered, finished it for him in her own plain fashion. "You expected a woman who'd need looking after. I've been looking after myself since I was 19, Mr. Brennan. I don't intend to start needing it now." But she said it without any real edge, and something in the exchange settled between them. Not romance exactly, not yet, but the particular, hard-won respect of two people who had just proven to each other, without a single wasted word, that they could be trusted in a genuine emergency. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both came to rely on. Josephine rose before first light most mornings, checking the herd on foot, since Split Rock kept no gentle enough horse to spare her, doctoring the small daily wounds a struggling outfit collects: a torn hoof, a scoured calf, a fence cut gone proud with infection, while Eli mended what fencing and water systems the drought hadn't already claimed. Silas Boone, the one hired hand Eli had kept on through the lean months, mostly out of loyalty neither of them could afford, watched the new arrival with open, arms-crossed doubt for the better part of 2 weeks, muttering more than once that a housekeeping wife had no business elbow-deep in a sick steer's flank. He changed his tune the day Josephine correctly diagnosed Blackleg in a yearling from 20 paces before the animal had even fully gone down, isolated it inside the hour, and saved the rest of the small herd from a disease that could have gutted what little stock they had left. And from that morning forward, Silas called her Miss Hale, with a respect that carried no trace of its earlier doubt, and took to asking her opinion on stock matters before he asked Eli's, which Eli noticed and did not mind one bit. Word traveled, the way it does in a small valley, and by the time Josephine rode into the Larkspur Hollow mercantile for salt and lamp oil, 3 ranchers she had never met stopped her at the counter to ask, half joking and half entirely serious, whether she might spare an afternoon to look at a limping mare or a scoured calf of their own. And Josephine, who had spent 12 years being handed the ugliest work in the Omaha yards without ever once being asked her opinion on anything, found the asking itself worth more to her than the coin they offered for it. Evenings brought their own quiet ritual. Josephine mended what she could of her ruined tool roll by lamplight, and Eli, watching her struggle one night with a stitching awl clearly meant for leather far thinner than a saddle strap, took it from her without asking and finished the seam himself with the careful, patient hands of a man who had learned harness work from his own father, handing it back without comment beyond a small, satisfied nod at his own stitching. She in turn braided him a new hondo for his lariat one quiet Sunday afternoon out of scrap rawhide, a small, practical gift neither of them named as anything more than practical, though Eli kept that rope coiled by his saddle rather than in the tack room from that day forward. And Josephine noticed that too, and said nothing, and felt something warm settle low in her chest regardless. They talked more on those evenings than either had expected to. Not declarations, never declarations, but the small, honest currency of two people learning each other's histories, one plain fact at a time. Her father's death, his mother's grave on the ridge above the barn, the particular quiet of a house that had held nobody's laughter in a long while, until gradually, without either of them announcing it, it began to hold theirs. Harlan Voss arrived at Split Rock 9 days before the note's due date, driving a polished black buggy up a rutted lane that had not seen a visitor so finely dressed in the better part of a year. A leather ledger tucked beneath one arm, and an expression that suggested he had already finished the business he'd come to conduct. He found Eli mending the lower corral gate and Josephine at the fence line beyond, doctoring a limping heifer, and Voss barely spared either of them a greeting before opening his ledger to a marked page. "I heard the storm flooded your lower pasture with green clover, Brennan," Voss said, his voice carrying the nasal patience of a man who enjoyed being right. "I confess I expected to find buzzards, not a working ranch, but the note stands regardless. $680, principal and interest, due the 15th of October, or Split Rock reverts to the bank in full. And I'll thank you to have your affairs in order by then, because the bank does not extend courtesy twice." Eli's jaw tightened, but it was Josephine who straightened from the fence line and crossed the yard, wiping her hands on a rag as she came, and Voss, to his evident surprise, found himself obliged to look up at her rather than down. "And you are?" Voss asked, his composure flickering for the first time. "Josephine Hale," she answered. "Soon to be Josephine Brennan, if the ranch and I both survive your bank's patience. The herd you nearly rode off is 52 head, every one of them on its feet and gaining weight on the best grass this valley has seen all year. And I'd think twice before you call this outfit finished, Mr. Voss, because I've spent 12 years grading beef for men considerably sharper than you, and I know exactly what 52 healthy head are worth come autumn." Voss recovered his composure with visible effort, informing her flatly that gaunt cattle in August meant nothing to a debt due in October, regardless of who was doctoring them, and that he would see the note satisfied in full or see the deed transferred, whichever the calendar produced first. And he climbed back into his buggy without waiting for a reply, driving off in a cloud of dust that seemed, to Eli's exhausted eye, entirely too pleased with itself. If these frontier stories mean something to you, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. It is what keeps them coming. That confrontation should have ended the matter until October, but Voss, apparently unsatisfied with merely waiting, returned to town and began quietly telling other ranchers and the traveling cattle buyer expected through Larkspur Hollow within the week that Split Rock's herd was worthless and the outfit as good as folded, hoping, Josephine suspected correctly, to poison the market against them before they ever got the chance to sell a single head at a fair price. Word of it reached them through Silas, who'd heard it secondhand at the mercantile and rode home hot enough to spit. And Josephine, rather than raging the way Eli half expected, went quiet and thoughtful in the particular way that had already come to mean she was working out an arithmetic problem nobody else in the room could see yet. "If Voss wants to poison the market before we've sold a single steer," she said finally, "then we don't let him do his lying in whispers. We make him say it to our faces, in front of the one man whose opinion actually decides what this herd is worth." She meant Mr. Whitfield, the railhead cattle buyer due through Larkspur Hollow on his annual circuit within the week. A man whose word on cattle value carried more weight in that valley than any banker's ledger. And Josephine's plan was simple and, to Eli's ear, more than a little audacious. She would meet Voss on his own ground, inside the cattleman's bank itself, with Whitfield and whatever ranchers happened to be waiting on bank business that morning standing witness, and settle the true value of Split Rock's herd in public, where a lie couldn't survive daylight and a fair number couldn't be quietly buried in a private ledger. Eli, who had spent 2 years watching Harlan Voss operate from a position of comfortable, unchallenged authority, found himself, for the first time since the drought began, genuinely looking forward to a trip into town. The Cattleman's Bank of Larkspur Hollow sat at the center of Main Street behind a row of tall windows meant to advertise a prosperity the rest of the drought-stricken valley no longer felt. And on the appointed morning, its narrow lobby held more witnesses than Josephine had strictly planned for. Mr. Whitfield, the railhead buyer, 3 ranching families waiting on their own business, and Silas Boone, who had ridden in early specifically to watch, he said plainly, in case anybody doubted his word about what happened after. Voss looked up from behind his desk with the faint, condescending smile of a man expecting to enjoy the next 10 minutes considerably more than the woman standing across from him, and he opened his ledger to the marked page before she had even fully crossed the lobby floor. "Mrs. Brennan to be," he said, drawing out the syllables. "I trust you've come to arrange the deed transfer, since I doubt 52 starved head have managed to become anything resembling $680 in the space of 9 weeks. "I've come to arrange no such thing," Josephine said, and her voice carried clean across the lobby, drawing every head in the room toward her without her needing to raise it a single degree. 52 head, Mr. Voss, crossbred Hereford stock with good frames under the leanness, and I've had them on cured upland hay and the last of that clover pasture for 9 weeks running. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, turning to the buyer directly, "would you care to step outside and look them over yourself before Mr. Voss finishes deciding what they're worth on my behalf?" Whitfield, visibly intrigued, agreed readily, and the small crowd in the lobby followed the 3 of them out to the hitching rail, where Eli had the herd's best dozen head penned in a borrowed corral for exactly this purpose. And Whitfield's practiced eye moved over the animals for a long, quiet minute before he allowed, plainly, that he'd seen considerably worse cattle bring considerably better prices, and that these would dress out respectably by October's end. Back inside, with Whitfield's assessment now a matter of public record in front of half a dozen witnesses, Josephine laid out her figures with the same flat, unhurried certainty she'd once used to settle disputes on the Omaha killing floor. 52 head, currently gaunt but carrying good frame, will dress out at roughly 580 pounds apiece by the 15th of October if they finish on the upland grass as planned. At 3 1/4 cents a pound dressed, that's $18.85 a head, near enough $980 for the herd entire, Mr. Voss, considerably more than the $680 this ranch owes you. But foreclosed today, and you own 52 head of half-finished cattle you'll have to hire drovers to move, pay auction fees on, and lose 1/5 of their value to shrinkage on the trail before they ever reach a railhead. And Mr. Whitfield here has just told this entire room, on the record, exactly what they're actually worth. You do the arithmetic, Mr. Voss. Foreclose, and the bank loses money on paper cattle it never had to touch. Wait 6 weeks, and you collect every dollar owed, plus the interest you're so fond of. In full, guaranteed. Voss opened his mouth to object, glanced once at Whitfield, who offered nothing beyond a small, confirming nod, and found, for the first time in a career built on other men's desperation, that the numbers in the room no longer belonged to him alone to decide. The silence stretched long enough that Silas Boone, unable to help himself, let out a low, satisfied whistle from the back of the lobby. 6 weeks, then, Voss said finally, his voice tight and considerably smaller than it had sounded 10 minutes earlier. The 15th of October, in full, or I will not hesitate a second time. He snapped his ledger shut and retreated toward his office without another word, and the lobby, which had gone dead silent through the entire exchange, seemed to exhale all at once. Ranchers Josephine had never met before that morning crossed the floor to shake her hand, and Mr. Whitfield told Eli plainly, within easy earshot, that he had married himself a woman who understood cattle better than most men who'd spent a lifetime at it, an assessment Eli did not dispute, and, standing there watching Josephine accept the handshakes of strangers with the same flat, unbothered competence she brought to everything else, felt no small measure of pride in agreeing with entirely. Even Voss's own clerk, a thin young man who had watched the whole exchange from behind the teller's cage with wide eyes, was overheard telling a friend later that week that he had never in 3 years seen Harlan Voss lose an argument to anybody, let alone lose it in his own lobby to a woman with rumen stains still faintly visible under her fingernails. October arrived at Split Rock Ranch not as a deadline anymore, but as an ordinary change of season. The herd finished fat on cured upland hay, exactly as Josephine had promised, sold to Mr. Whitfield at a price that cleared the note to Harlan Voss with better than $40 left over. The first honest surplus the ranch had seen in 2 years. On the evening after the sale, Eli found Josephine on the porch, mending the tool roll that had never quite recovered from its first brutal day of use, and he sat down beside her without quite knowing how to say what he'd come to say, so he simply said it plain, the way she'd taught him plain was usually best. "Preacher rides through Larkspur Hollow on Thursday," he said. "I wrote that advertisement 5 months ago, hoping for a housekeeper and a warm body to sit with when the ranch finally went under. I got a business partner instead, a stock doctor, and if I'm being honest, the only person who's ever looked at this failing outfit and seen something worth fighting for instead of something worth pitying. I'd like to make good on the original offer, if you'll still have it." Josephine set the tool roll down slowly. "Don't mistake me for something soft, Eli," she said, her voice steadier than she quite felt. "I've got a stockyard's worth of scars on these hands, and I'll never be the kind of wife who sits pretty on a porch doing needlework. I smell like tallow and rendered fat half the year, and I'll spend the other half elbow deep in some animal or another. You want a wife? You could find one considerably gentler than me in Cheyenne inside a week." Eli took her scarred hand in both of his, calloused palm against calloused palm, and answered without a moment's hesitation. "I had Gentle once, before the drought. Gentle packed a bag and went back east the first hard season it met. I don't want Gentle, Josephine. I want the woman who put her hand inside a dying steer to save my herd and stared down a banker with nothing but arithmetic and nerve. I look at you and I see the only solid ground this ranch has stood on in 2 years." "Thursday, then," Josephine said finally, and something in her voice cracked warm at the edges for the first time since she'd stepped off that train. "But I'm wearing my work boots to it. I'll rip a hem trying to manage anything finer climbing into that wagon." They married that Thursday on the porch of a ranch that had very nearly not survived the summer. Silas Boone standing witness with his hat pressed to his chest, Mr. Whitfield riding out special from the railhead to see it done, and half a dozen ranchers from the valley who a season earlier would not have known either of their names crowding the yard besides. Split Rock Ranch, once counted among the valley's certain losses, entered its next hard winter with a full ledger, a doctored and thriving herd, and 2 people who had built whatever they now shared out of shared work, rather than easy promises, which in that country was the only kind of foundation that ever truly held. Josephine kept her father's rendering knife on the mantel from that winter forward, not as a keepsake exactly, but as a plain reminder that the secret skill nobody in Larkspur Hollow had thought to ask a woman about was, in the end, the very thing that had kept the whole valley's arithmetic honest. And that, friends, is the whole of it, both fires burning clean through to the end, exactly as I promised you at the start. If this story settled somewhere warm in your chest tonight, there's another one waiting for you, complete from first hoofbeat to last, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit by the fire again soon. I'll leave the gate open.